Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here at this presentation. My name is John McQueen. I am a faculty member in the School of Social and Family Dynamics in the field of sociology at Arizona State University. And I am also a PhD student in the same department. This project is part of my dissertational research conducted with my committee chair, the fabulous Dr. Elisa Jane Bienenstock. Today, I will be discussing what we call the trappings of trust. And I want to start today with a simple question. If trust in institutions is declining, what still makes an institution appear trustworthy enough for a family to hand over the parental guardianship of their own child in crisis? Using the troubled teen industry as a case, I examine how websites build trust through language, imagery, moral framing, and symbolic legitimacy. My argument is that these websites do more than provide information. They help institutional placement appear credible, caring, and necessary during family uncertainties. So let's get into it, shall we? The project begins with a familiar observation. Trust appears to be declining. We can look at Putnam points to how weakening social capital, while survey measures such as the GSS and the World Value Survey suggests long-term declines in these generalized trusts and institutional confidence. But those measures capture attitudes, right? They tell us about behavior and under crisis. The box on the left highlights the broader trust literature. The box on the right highlights the problem that motivates the study. Families still make high stakes decisions under uncertainty, often relying on institutions they have never directly experienced. And that shift is part of the question. The issue is not whether trust is declining. It is what makes an institution appear trustworthy enough for this action for people to act, right? And this leads us into the kind of guiding question that is part of this project is pretty straightforward. What makes an institution appear trustworthy when families are in crisis and making decisions under that fear, urgency, or stress? But it also starts the larger conversation of the starting point comes from the trust literature. We know a great deal about people's reporting trust, right? We know much less about how trust is produced when people act under senses of precarity and uncertainty. That brings in the empirical puzzle. Despite decades of public controversies, many families continue to encounter the troubled teen industry programs as credible and caring solutions during these moments of precarity and crisis. And this is why the TTI is such a useful case. These websites provide a window, per se, into this trust production. They allow us to observe how legitimacy is constructed before placement ever even occurs, which leads us to the bottom statement that we'll be looking at, right? What makes the troubled teen industry analytically valuable is that parents are not simply evaluating information. They are deciding whether an institution should be trusted with the care of their child in crisis. And for that reason, the TTI offers an unusually visible setting for studying how trust and trustworthiness are socially produced. So the diagram in front of you on this slide shifts the focus from the individual to relationships. On the left side is the family embedded within a personal network of friends, relatives, advisors, community ties. On the right is the institutions embedded within its own network of consultants, therapists, admission staff, credentials, referrals, and organizational affiliates. Trust emerges in the spaces between the two networks. This is where the concept of institutional trust brokerage becomes useful. Families rarely encounter institutional structures directly. They encounter people, symbols, credentials, referrals, and relationships that help make institutions appear trustworthy. And that's important to pay attention to. Now, when we look further at these diagrams, the troubled teen industry provides a useful stress test for the theories of trust as a whole. In many cases, trust research examines situations where information is limited. Here, warning signals are often publicly available throughout survivor testimonies, investigative reporting, legal records, and regulatory documents. That makes the TTI analytically useful and interesting. Rather than asking how trust develops in the absence of information, this case allows us to examine how trust persists even when evidence of risk remains. And that lets us ask the question, what is the glue that makes risky institutions appear credible, caring, and responsible? So the glaring question that might be on some of your heads is, what am I talking about? What is the troubled teen industry? What is a TTI? The troubled teen industry is not a single organization. It is a fragmented field of programs that present adolescent intervention as treatment, rehabilitation, correction, or transformation. Said differently, a loosely regulated field of private and public institutions that present adolescent intervention as treatment, correction, or transformation. The field includes wilderness therapy programs, therapeutic boarding schools, residential treatment centers, transport services, faith-based organizations, conversion therapy camps, and other youth intervention models. While these organizations differ, they rely on a similar referral network therapeutic language, and crisis response narratives. That fragmentation matters because legitimacy is not inherited from one central authority. It must be assembled across institutions, actors, and symbolic systems. Programs borrow credibility from therapy, education, medicine, religion, wilderness healing, and family restoration. And my argument here is that the durability of the TTI depends not only on the treatment claims, but on the successful kind of production of the institutional legitimacy. Its durability really rests on this, and it is a question we have to ask that I feel sociology will provide. So before getting into the findings, let me briefly explain the analytic strategy that I have utilized inside this presentation. The data set consists of 45 trouble teen industry website programs or websites, approximately about 56,000 words of website text, rich format text, and 537 coded sentences. I begin with kind of a qualitative content analysis and a cross-site thematic coding to identify reoccurring trust-building themes. I then examine sentence-level co-occurrences patterns to understand which themes repeatedly appear together and used a matrix comparison to assess consistency across websites. To strengthen the analysis, I added an archival layer that included incident reports, licensing and inspection records, survivor testimony, and closures or rebranding histories from a repository known as Unsilenced. The overall strategy was to move from the repeated language patterns to the reoccurring sentence structures to the archive-based comparison in order to better understand how institutional trustworthiness is constructed and maintained. Which leads us into the types of the trappings of trust, which is the title of this paper. We see the institutional provides legitimacy, the personal network embeddedness, and the semantics provides solutions. So this slide looks to summarize the framework that emerged from this analysis. And institutions provide that legitimacy through the credentials, expertise, education, and even the therapeutic authority. The personal networks provide embeddedness through referrals, consultants, clergy, trusted relationships, and the language provides the solutions by transforming uncertainty into a coherent story about crisis intervention repair. Taken together, these become what myself and Elisa call trappings of trust. The remaining slides show how these elements repeatedly appear across websites and how they work together to make the institutional placement appear credible, caring, and appropriate. From family strain to institutional urgency, we see that Reuben Hill's ABCX model from the 50s/late 40s helped organize one of the most consistent patterns in the data that I was looking at. Across the websites, adolescent distress was repeatedly framed through a sequence that closely mirrors the model. Stressors such as behavioral concerns, mental health challenges, family conflict, difficulties were identified alongside kind of the descriptions of the strained family, resources, and limited alternatives. The most important, though, within the ABCX model for this category would be C, the family's definition of the situation. Through both language and imagery, the websites repeatedly perform interpretive work by defining distress as a crisis requiring specialized intervention. In Hill's framework, it is not the stressor alone that shapes outcome, but how situations come to be understood. And from a content analysis perspective, what emerged was not simply a presence of crisis language, but a reoccurring narrative structure. Across sites, websites constantly helped construct a definition of a family strain that made institutional placement appear as the appropriate response. So, a digital moral archive of the troubled teen industry across programs, placement was rarely persisted as a technical service or administrative decision. Instead, it was embedded within the moral narrative about what responsibilities families should do during moments of crisis. This is where I found Schrader's work on autonomy, community, and divinity became particularly useful. The websites repeatedly reframed intervention through the obligations to family, responsibility, healing, growth, and protection and restoration. Viewed together, these themes form what I describe as a digital moral architecture. The websites do not simply explain services, they provide a moral framework through which institutional placement can be understood as caring, responsible, and appropriate. The important finding is not a single theme, it's how these themes work together to make intervention feel morally legitimate. Now, I did a matrix analysis. The slide really shows the archival comparison strategy used here. For each centered case, websites claim were paired with archival records, including inspections, incident reports, licensing documentation, legal findings, survivor testimony, and organizational histories from the repository website and nonprofit group Unsilenced. What makes this matrix allow us to do is move beyond asking what institutions say about themselves and examine those claims alongside historical records. The goal is not to determine here whether every promise is true or false. It's about the institutional promises empirically and historical testability. One of the most important findings emerged from from this comparison. Public records do not automatically undermine legitimacy. Programs can continue to present themselves as caring, therapeutic, and restorative even when warning signals remain publicly available and facing. The broader implication is that the trust depends not only on information, but on how credibility is organized, presented, and maintained over time. And so, what we'll see on this slide is that one thing became very clear quickly. Therapy talk emerged almost everywhere, but it rarely appeared by itself. What consistently accompanied it was themes of family crisis, family repair, and redemptive care. I would draw your attention to those connections because that combination is what matters. Across institutions, a remarkably similar narrative emerged. A family faces crisis, right? Intervention is then framed through therapeutic language, and placement is presented as a pathway towards repair and restoration of that crisis. What we are seeing is not a collection of isolated marketing decisions. No, we are seeing a shared cultural framework for making institutional intervention appear caring, necessary, and legitimate. The model on the right captures that process, crisis, therapy, repair, working together to transform uncertainty into that kind of confidence in that choice of your placement. So, the co-occurrences analysis helps move beyond the frequencies, okay, and examine how meaning is constructed. The strongest pairing was family crisis and therapy talk, followed by family repair and therapy talk. What matters is not simply that these themes appear across websites, but that they are repeatedly embedded within the same sentences. Crisis language establishes urgency, while therapy talk provides a legitimate vocabulary for intervention. Family repair then links the intervention to restoration and reunification. Taken together, these patterns reveal that kind of reoccurring moral narrative, which crisis, treatment, and repair are connected through shared therapeutic logic. So therapy talk becomes one of the most consistent patterns in the data set. What interests me was not the presence of therapeutic language itself, but what the language accomplished. Across the websites, institutional practice is reframed through the language of care. Removal becomes treatment, control becomes accountability, discipline becomes growth, and family rupture becomes repair. The sociological question we can all ask ourselves is not whether these claims are true or false. No, it's how language makes institutional intervention appear therapeutic, restorative, and morally responsible, right? In that sense, therapy talk functions as a trust signal. It helps transforms this authority into care, which the pattern becomes even more clear when we look at the language directly. At Provo Canyon, parents are told choosing the best care for your child. At Chrysalis in Montana, families are invited to call us to start transformation. Phrases such as effective treatment, sense of belonging do more than describe services. They recast family stress as a therapeutic need and institutional placement as a pathway toward repair and restoration. Notice what is largely absent, the language of control, confinement, separation, and institutional authority. Instead, the emphasis on care, healing, growth, belonging, and then transformation. What emerges is not simply a description of services, but a moral narrative, in which intervention appears caring, responsible, and importantly, necessary. So, what emerged from the act of comparison was not simply contrast between promises and records, but a gap between public presentation and institutional history. On one side of the narrative of healing, transformation, and belonging and family repair, on the other side of inspections, incident reports, licensing records, survivor testimony, closures, and rebranding of these locations. The important finding is that the existence of warning signals does not automatically undermine legitimacy. Families often encounter these institutions through trusted networks, referrals, crisis response pathways, long before they encounter the archival records. The sociological question we can all ask ourselves in this audience is not simply what information exists, it's why some information becomes consequential while other information remains peripheral. The promise record gap helps reveal this kind of credibility can persist, even when evidence remains publicly available. Now, in front of you is a visual representation. I want you to take a look at it. Look at the smiling faces. Look at Shelterwood having this family imagery. Second Nature is this nature and healing imagery. Casa by the Sea is this brochure credential style materials. These images are not decorative. They are functioning as trust signals. Just as therapy talk works through language, these visuals work through symbolism. They communicate safety, belonging, expertise, and legitimacy. And then the network shown here helps move the discussion beyond websites. What the analysis suggests is that families are not evaluating institutions in isolation. They are embedded within personal networks, while institutions are embedded within organizational networks. The social network diagram illustrates this process. Trust signals flow through consultants, clergy, therapists, referrals, family members, reviews, and credentials and institutional affiliations before a placement decision is ever made. From a symbolic interactionist perspective, trustworthiness is not something an institution simply simply possesses. It is presented through symbols, interpreted through relationships, and reinforced through networks. The key point is that trust emerges between the truster, trustee, and through these connections. The website is only one node within a much larger system of production. And the big sociological question is not only whether care is real, but how care is made to appear legitimate. And the broader contribution of this project is not simply what reveals about the troubled teen industry, but what it reveals about trust itself. Across the analysis, trustworthiness emerged not as an inherent quality of institutions, but something produced through image, language, symbols, and relationship networks. The website examined here makes the process unusually visible, therapeutic language, family repair narratives, and confidential imagery, referrals, and institutional brokers work together to transform uncertainty into confidence and crisis into action. What emerges again is not an isolated decision, no, but a socially embedded process of trust formation. For sociologists, the question is not only whether institutions are trustworthy, it's how trustworthiness becomes recognizable, believable, and actionable in the first place. Trustworthiness is not found. I would argue that it is made. Now, I have a list of references here for you, but I want to close by acknowledging the survivors, the advocates, and the journalists and archivists whose work made this analysis possible. As a survivor of these programs, this research is personally meaningful to me. More importantly, it reflects experiences of the hundreds of thousands of youth sent into these institutions each year. My hope is that sociology can contribute to the broader effort to understand, challenge, and ultimately end abuse within these systems. My central claim, is that trust is not naive or irrational, is that trust is socially organized. The troubled teen industry makes this process unusually visible. Trustworthiness is not found, as mentioned before, it is made. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.